I remember the wind first, not the kind that sings or sweetens a man's face, but the kind that scours it, full of powdered earth and the ghost smell of alkali. It came low across the flats that day, pushing the sage into a tired sway and combing the tall grass like a rough hand. I had been riding half the morning with my hat pulled low, the brim rutted by years of sun and squinting, and I let that wind do what it pleased. Out here, a man learns to be easy with the world's moods. He fights the things that can be mended, fences, broken cinches, stubborn cattle, and he leaves the rest to God and weather. The stage road cut a pale seam to my right, running all the way from the low hills to the wide nowhere. The stations along it were dull boxes of plank and nail, dots etched into boards that warped in summer and froze in winter, with a pump well, a coal pile if the operator was lucky, and a shade bench for the waiting. I had no cause to stop most days, not since I made up my mind to keep to myself and let my grief settle where it would. I kept the ranch small and the talk smaller, and when evening came, I cooked for one and listened to the stove chatter to itself. It is strange what a stove will say to a man who does not ask for answers. I had not planned to draw up at the station that afternoon, but my mare wanted water, and I could not argue with her. She was a good sorrel with a clean star, the only creature I owned that met me every morning glad to see me. We turned off the road and came in slow behind the corral, where a row of posts stood crooked as teeth, and a strip of burlap flapped like a prayer unanswered. I dismounted, loosened the cinch to let her breathe, and led her to the trough where the pump clacked and drooled, making that honest sound of iron working over water. That was when I saw her. She was on the bench under the shadowed eave, a small bundle of a woman with a valise at her boots and a scarf knotted too neat for this place. The fabric had a city look, something that would rip at the first good thorn, and it tugged at me the way a bluebird will in October when you know it ought to be long gone south. She had her head bowed into her hands, and the wind tried to pry those fingers loose and could not. You could tell she had been crying by the way her shoulders held themselves like a fence post after a season of storms, still upright, but sunk a little deeper. I kept quiet at first. A cowboy learns to read silence the way other men read newspapers, and the silence around her had a line or two I did not yet know. The station agent had walked off somewhere, or maybe he had drunk himself into a corner in the lean-to. There was only her, the wind, and the rustle of the cottonwood that had lived long enough to make a sound like an old man clearing his throat. I let the mare drink. I rubbed her nose to tell her she had done well by me, and I stood facing the bench as if it were a ridge I needed to cross. There are moments a man does not choose. Not really. He may say he did later in the retelling, but the truth is the trail chooses him, and he just sets his weight to the saddle. That day, the trail was a woman left waiting where the plains run out of patience. I stepped off the dust and into the eave shade, and with the sun cut off, the air went cool and the light softened, and I saw her face. She was not pretty in the polished way of town portraits, but there was something clear about her, a kind of brave that had forgotten itself for an hour or two. The corners of her mouth were steady, even if her eyes were red. She looked up at me with no fear in it. Women learn fear early, and I have never blamed them for it. But hers was a look that had been taught other things first, maybe trust, maybe pride, and the fact that those things were bruised did not take the shape out of them. I took my hat off. "Afternoon, ma'am," I said, because that is what you say when lives are about to change and you do not yet know how. "You waiting on the coach or the man who is meant to meet it?" She tried to answer and found the words brittle. They came apart when the wind touched them like dry leaves. She swallowed once, then twice, and worked her hands, smoothing the knuckles as if the right sentence might be hiding there. At last she said, "Both. I was." There's a kind of tenderness that makes a man clumsy. I felt it then, and it made me wish for a smaller body, a softer boot, a voice that did not scrape. I said, "The coach is running late, dust out of the south, it does that." I did not ask about the man. Sometimes a question is a knife. If you love a thing, you keep it sheathed. She nodded, as if I had done her a small kindness. The wind loosened a strand of hair and laid it across her cheek. She did not move to put it right. I saw then that she had a folded veil inside the valise, a faint white corner with beadwork that had never met a church door. I looked away because it seemed indecent to see it. The mare, having had her fill, lifted her head and blew foam, and the sound of it was as human as any sigh. I told myself to leave. I had water for the horse, and time waiting at home for no one. But the old ache in me, the one I carried on the left side like a pocketed stone, shifted at the sight of that veil. I had worn a ring until the flesh beneath it thinned. I had learned the size of a room after the person who fills it is gone. I had learned the weight of a name when no one speaks it out loud. It is a curious mercy, the way the heart does not die of these things. It just keeps its own counsel, working at night like a farm mill, and after a time the noise turns into quiet. "Ma'am," I said, and the word had the feel of a pledge in it, though I had not yet offered one. "There's coffee on a stove not an hour from here, and a roof that does not leak when the wind has its temper. I live quiet. I say little. A person can sit at my table and not be obliged to talk. If you are waiting, I can set you there to wait in peace. If you are not, you can warm your hands and decide what a day like this ought to hold." She watched me as if I had set a map between us and asked her to pick a river. "Why would you do that?" she asked, and her voice had no flattery in it, only a plain need for truth. "Because a bench is a cruel place to be alone," I said. "Because I have known worse and would not have you know more of it. Because there's no shame in taking shelter while you choose what to do with your life. That is not a small thing to decide." The cottonwood muttered over us. The veil's white corner shone and dimmed like a pulse. She folded her hands and looked past me to the horse, who held my whole character in one modest shape, a sound back, good manners, no ribbon on the bridle. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that a quiet table sounds like a church to me just now." "It can be that," I said, "or it can be just a table." She gathered herself then, a movement like a bird choosing to fly. She stood, smoothed the skirt that had wrinkled under so much sitting, and lifted the valise. It was heavier than her arm believed, and I stepped forward to take it without making a display of it. She let me. The bench gave back her shape, a shallow comfort that made me sudden angry at the world. I let that anger drain away. Anger is like whiskey in the morning. It lies to you about what it will cure. "What shall I call you?" I asked. She told me her name. The wind tried to take it, but I kept it. A man can keep a name safe. I gave her mine and watched it fit in her mouth, and when she said it, something moved in me like a door that had been shut a long time. We walked to the mare. I set her up in the saddle and tied the valise to the back with a hitch I would trust to hold a year. I took the lead rope in my hand and swung up behind her, leaving the station to its shadows and the wind to its chores. When we turned toward my place, the sun caught the edge of a far cloud and gilded it, cheap as tin but handsome at a distance. She said nothing, and I said nothing, and between us there was a quiet that was not empty. After a mile, the trail narrowed to a ribbon where wagon wheels had gnawed the earth. I let the mare choose her footing. The land to our left fell away into a shallow wash where water ran 2 weeks out of the year, and memory the rest of it. To our right, the grass lifted and pressed like a congregation. Somewhere ahead, the ranch sat with its porch boards cupped and its stovepipe holding last winter's soot. I had polished nothing for anyone. Yet as we rode, I began to think about how I might sweep a floor, how I might set out a second cup, how I might lay another place at the table where the wood was worn smooth in front of my chair. There is a room inside a man he forgets to open. The key to it is ordinary. We did not speak again until we saw the lone cottonwood near the creek that belongs to my land. The tree stands with one limb broken and one sound, a shape I have taken comfort in. When it came into view, she drew a breath that shook once and then steadied, and I thought, here's a woman who has forgotten how to hope and is remembering. I did not say it. Hope is like fire. You cup it with both hands and keep the wind off until it can find its own strength. The cottonwood by the creek was the first to greet us, as if it had been waiting, with a patience I never owned. We crossed below it, where the water ran thin and glassy over stones, worn kind by a century of thaw and break. The mare stepped careful, hocks working neat as a seamstress's hands, and the woman in front of me, she leaned forward in the saddle the way a person does when she's done being a burden, even to a horse. I respected that, and wished she had not felt the need. On my north fence the wire hummed, a tune strung by distance, and the small argument wine makes with metal. The house stood plain beyond the yard gate, boards silvered by years, rafters honest, a porch that dipped a little where men had come and gone, though for a long time it had been only me. The chimney wore a black mustache where the smoke curled in wet weather. The corral slouched by the barn, poles scarred by teeth and weather and the long rub of restless hides. It looked like what it was, a place still standing because hands kept showing up, not because any prayer had pinned it there. She took it in without flourish. City folk sometimes gape or wince at the lean beauty of a working place. She didn't either. Her eyes went from gate to pump to house to barn, quick and thoughtful, and something in me lifted, respect offered, and returned. When we reached the yard, I dismounted first, steadying the stirrup for her. She set her boot in my palm the way a person sets trust down, not lightly but sure. When her feet touched the dust, she straightened her skirt and put one hand to the saddle horn, as if to thank the leather for being honest all the way here. "I'll stable the mare," I said. "There's a bucket by the pump if you want to wash the road from your hands. Kitchen door sticks. Lift while you push." She nodded. I led the horse to the barn, listening to the small domestic sounds a place makes when it welcomes you. The rattle in the pump rod, the porch board with a secret complaint, the kitchen window tapping in its frame. I forked a barrow of sweet hay, checked the water barrel, set out grain, and ran a brush along the mare's neck until her eyelid fell like a curtain. I said the word I always say to her, home, and she flicked an ear as if to say, that would do. At the kitchen, the door made the usual case for itself and then accepted instruction. She had found the bucket and the cake of lye soap. Her hands were pale where the glove lines used to be, knuckles reddened by wind. She washed with the care of a person who has been taught that water, like mercy, is not to be wasted. When she finished, I handed her a dish towel thin as an old shirt and said, "Coffee will be along shortly. I keep it strong to wake a man twice." "I could make it," she said, "if you'd like." I did not know then that a woman asking to make coffee can be a form of prayer. I stepped aside. She moved into the room as if it belonged to any soul who behaved with manners. She studied the stove, found the kettle by looking where it ought to be rather than where I had left it, and shook a measured pour from the bean can into the grinder. The sound of that handle turning, the dry little growl of it, worked on me in ways I have never had the schooling to describe. It took something unruly in my chest and put it to task. I set 2 cups on the table and felt suddenly shy about them. They were matched only by capacity. One was blue with a chip that had chased me through 3 winters. The other was white, but for the sun's slow thumbprint along its rim. She set the kettle, folded her hands, and waited without fidget. Time changed shape around her. It became a thing with joints that bent instead of a board you had to shoulder. "Do you live alone?" she asked, and she asked it like someone inquiring after a fever, not to pry but to know the care required. "Yes," I said, "a long while now." She did not offer a condolence. Bless her for that. Pity sticks worse than dust. Instead, she said, "It's a good kitchen. Every useful thing has a place, and the useless things have not been invited." I laughed before I knew I would, a small sound that startled me, as if a bird had flown across the room. "I've never owned a thing that did not earn its keep, I said, myself included, on the best days." The kettle went to whispering. She poured slow, letting the bloom rise in the pot before she finished the water. The smell climbed into the rafters and came back down clean. She set a cup before me, kept one for herself, and took the chair across. We sat like that a moment, listening to the wind conferring with the eaves. "I thank you," she said, and she meant the table and the cup and the idea of shelter. "I had thought I would be brave when I came west, but I find I am mostly tired." "There's a kind of bravery that looks exactly like resting," I said. "It is not much sung about, but it keeps people alive." We drank. The coffee steadied the places that had rattled loose in me since the station. I did not ask for her story. I have learned a woman's story arrives when it is ready, and sometimes the telling is a second hurt. But she looked at me over the rim of the cup, with a decision moving behind her eyes, and I made room for it, as you would make room for a skittish colt in a crowded pen. "My name is Zara," she said. I had kept it already from the wind at the station, but hearing it here, seated at my table, fixed it in the house with a nail. "Zara," I repeated, letting the syllables find their own chair in my mouth. "I came to be married," she said simply. "I had a letter. There were promises in it. My aunt in Boston thought it wise. She said men were plentiful in the West, and a woman with decent sense could do better there than in drawn rooms where every thought is only a smaller version of itself. I believed her. I sold what I had a right to sell. I kept what I could not bear to give away. And I came. She let the steam from the cup fog her lashes and clear. He did not come to meet the coach. There was a note written by someone else. It said he'd taken a wife already in haste, which felt like theft, and that I would understand. She stopped there, not because the words failed, but because they were not worth the breath. I set my cup down with the carefulness men use when they are keeping a temper from an unhelpful life of its own. Folks who write notes like that, I said, ought to be made to carry them on their person, so when the wind tears at them, they feel what they have done. A corner of her mouth learned again how to be alive. You speak plainer than most, she said. I work cattle. They do not reward poetry. I waited then, not for more hurt, but for the small practical question that always comes after. She did not disappoint me. Would you be hiring, she asked, in any fashion that could fit a woman? I can keep books clean as a whistle, and I can cook what a man can eat. I can mend. I can mind things. If I may stay until the month turns, I will find work in town or passage elsewhere. But I would pay my way until then, and leave you better than I found you. I looked at the ledger on the shelf, with its pages fattened by receipts and dust. I thought of the hinge on the barn door that wanted a second set of hands when the wind threw it against its stops. I thought of nights when a lamp burns too low because no one remembers to trim the wick on time. And I thought of how quiet can be a blessing until it hardens into a wall. I would hire you, I said, on wages fit to make a life start over, not just end a day. There is no shame in paying a person for what they are good at. Her eyes shone without spilling. Then I will earn every cent, she said, and I will leave when it is right to leave. That is a bargain between two decent souls. I said, I will write it nowhere and keep it everywhere. She stood then, not to go, but to see. She walked the small circumference of the kitchen, learning the drawers and the lamp oil and the broom's lean place. She opened the back door to the yard and watched the sky set itself in evening colors, a streak of rose laid across a deepening blue, as if the day had been bandaged and was already mending. She touched the door frame as she closed it, a small benediction no preacher taught her. I have a spare room, I said. It is honest. The window sticks and colds, and the quilt is heavier than it looks. If you take it as your own. No one will come through that door uninvited, not even me. The relief that moved through her was quiet and total, like rain soaking a field. Thank you, she said, and the words were not enough, but they were all that language allows. I showed her the room. It had been made years back for someone who never came to claim it. The bedstead held a history of knots. The pitcher on the washstand remembered water from other creeks, and the mirror did a kind thing with the light at that hour. She set her valise on the chair and let her palm rest on the lid a heartbeat longer than necessary, then turned to me. I'll leave you to your settling, I said. Supper will be plain. If you do not mind plain, you will not starve in my care. I do not mind plain, she said, and the way she said it told me that plainness, given gently, is a luxury after cruelty. I left her there and moved through the small tasks that make a house truthful. Slicing salt pork, rinsing beans, striking a match to the stove's temper until it consented to burn like it meant it. Her footsteps came light down the hall as the room rearranged itself to accept her, and for the first time in a long while, the house sounded like more than boards and a man's intention. We ate with the easy silence of two people who have nothing to prove. When the dishes were stacked to dry and the lamp trimmed, I walked out to the porch to make my evening peace with the sky. She joined me without asking, and we stood side by side while the last birds wrote their names on the light and folded themselves into the cottonwood. Something in my chest let go and did not fall. It hovered, the way a hawk does when it finds a current that will hold it up with no effort at all. The night came slow over the flats, the way night always does out here, slipping in quiet, cautious, like it's afraid to scare the last of the light away. The sky turned the color of cool to iron, and then darker still. A man can feel his own heart in that kind of silence. You start to wonder what you've done with all your years, and why the dust on your boots feels older than your bones. She stood beside me, hands folded in front of her, eyes set on the far edge of everything. You could tell she was listening, not for me, not even for herself, but for something bigger, like an answer she hadn't dared to ask for in a long time. The wind tugged at her hair again, that same loose strand that refused to behave since I'd first seen her. I thought about reaching to tuck it behind her ear, but a cowboy knows the worth of distance. Some things you don't touch too soon. You get used to quiet, I said. My voice came out lower than I meant it. It starts to sound like company if you give it enough time. She smiled, small, the kind that doesn't need light to be seen. Where I came from, quiet was a luxury. The streets were never still, and even the church bells seemed to compete with themselves. I reckon they don't know what to do when they ain't ringing. I said, no, she whispered out there, they don't. We stood that way for a spell, watching the stars begin to blink into being. First the bright ones, then the shy ones hiding behind a thin smear of cloud. The sky in Montana is a thing that'll humble you. It's too wide for regret, too deep for complaint. A man could ride every day of his life and never reach the edge of it. I'd spent years under that same sky with no one to share it with. You start talking to things then. The horses, the stove, the wind. You say things that never get answered, and somehow that makes it easier to keep saying them. But that night, I found myself thinking that maybe a man isn't meant to carry every silence alone. You miss him? I asked, before I could stop the words. Her breath caught soft. I don't think I ever really had him, she said. Not truly. I think I was in love with a promise. I nodded, though she wasn't looking. Promises can be sweet poison. You take a sip thinking it'll cure the thirst, but all it does is burn slow. She turned her head then, studying me like a person trying to place a face from an old dream. And you? She asked. Do you miss her? The question hung there between us, the kind of question a man doesn't get asked much, not out here where feelings are something you bury deep and mark with a rock. I took a breath and let it out, long and even. Every morning, I said every damn sunrise since the day I watched her go. She was sick, and I was too proud to ask for help soon enough. I thought strength meant I had to fix it myself. But strength, I looked out at the stars, at the slow draw of night moving across the horizon. Strength ain't what keeps you standing. It's what helps you kneel when you finally can't. Her eyes softened. I'm sorry. I shook my head. Don't be. I've made my peace with it. Or most of it anyhow. We stood until the night was full, and the sky had that pale dusting of silver that means the moon's thinking about rising. When the chill set in, I turned and pushed the door open. The warm breath of the stove rolled out to meet us. Inside, the lamp's glow caught her face, softening the lines that worry had carved there. I fetched the old blanket from the peg near the door and handed it to her. You'll be wanting this tonight. The wind comes down the valley mean after midnight. She took it, her fingers brushing mine, and that small touch, barely there, was enough to wake something that had been sleeping under my ribs a long, long time. Thank you, she said, for everything. There ain't much I've done. I say all my nightmares offered what was empty. She smiled again, faint but sure. Sometimes that's the only kind of offering that matters. I watched her walk down the short hall to the spare room, the lamplight following her like a promise that kept its word. When her door closed, the house settled different, breathing almost, the way a man does when he realizes he's not the only heartbeat left in the dark. I stayed up a while after that, sitting by the stove, listening to the fire chew through its wood. Every crack sounded like a word half spoken. I thought about how healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in the slow moments. A cup of coffee shared, a roof that doesn't leak, a silence that doesn't feel empty. Before I turned in, I checked the latch on her door, not to keep her in, but to make sure it would hold against the wind. That's what Karen looks like out here, quiet, unseen, steady. When I finally lay down, the room smelled faintly of coffee and pine smoke. My hat hung on the wall, my gun on the table. I closed my eyes and saw her again, sitting on that bench, dust swirling around her like the last prayer of the day. Maybe she'd been waiting for someone to find her. Maybe I'd been waiting for someone to find me. Either way, the waiting was over. Morning came, like it always does out here, soft at first, then sharp, burning away the blue chill that clings to the ground before sunrise. I woke to the sound of the pump outside, the long squeak of iron working over water. For a moment, I thought it was a memory, some echo from years ago when the house still held laughter, but the rhythm was steady, real, alive. She was already up. I pulled on my boots and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of dew and wood smoke, with a promise of heat waiting behind the hills. She stood by the trough in that same simple dress from yesterday. Sleeves rolled, the early light turning her hair to pale copper. She was pumping water into a tin basin, splashing her face like a child learning the morning. "Hope the pump didn't wake you," she said, not looking up. "It's a fine sound," I said. "Better than the wind playing sheriff with the shutters." She smiled. There's something about seeing someone smile for the first time in daylight. It's different than a smile by lamplight. Daylight has a way of telling the truth. Inside, I set the skillet on the stove and broke 2 eggs, the kind that rattle in your hand like coins from a dry well. She came in soon after, hair damp, face fresh, but still carrying the long road behind it. "You didn't have to cook for me," she said. "I don't have to," I said. "But a man who eats alone too long forgets what company tastes like." She helped without asking, found the flour, the tin of salt, and stirred biscuit dough with the quiet focus of someone who'd been taught to measure life in spoons and patience. When the food hit the table, we bowed our heads without a word. Some prayers don't need saying. They just sit between two people like steam off a cup. After breakfast, I showed her the ledger in the storeroom behind the kitchen. Shelves of beans, salt pork, and sacks of oats lined the walls. The books were honest but tired, pages bent, and numbers leaning like fences in need of fixing. She traced a finger down the columns. "You keep a fair hand," she said, "but you've been cheated on feed prices. See here, 2 entries doubled under different suppliers." I leaned against the doorway, watching her eyes move quick as a sparrow. "Never did trust that freight clerk from Helena," I said. "I'll make a note," she replied, "and send a letter with the next rider. Might be time someone reminded him that cowboys read numbers too." That made me laugh, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. "You're a braver accountant than most Pinkertons I've known." "Pinkertons?" she asked, glancing up. "Worked with one a spell," I said. Years back, before the ranch. Chased thieves through bad weather and worse whiskey. Thought I'd seen every kind of lie a man can sell until I met the ones that live polite in ledgers." She smiled faintly. "Then you know the kind I'm after." By noon, she'd sorted half the year's records. The kitchen table was covered with neat stacks of paper tied with twine. I mended the north corral gate and brought in water for the stock. It felt strange, that quiet rhythm of shared work. No words wasted, no noise that didn't belong. The house, which used to echo, now hummed low like a living thing. When the sun sat straight overhead, we took shade on the porch. I poured her a cup of well water, and she looked out across the pasture, eyes following the horses that moved slow and content near the fence line. "It's beautiful," she said, "not the way cities are. Cities shout about their beauty. This place, it just stands there, waiting to be seen." "That's the trick of it," I said. "Out here nothing asks for notice. You either see it or you don't. Same goes for people, I reckon." She turned her face toward me, studying the lines carved there by time and weather. "And what would you say you've seen, Mr. Quinn?" "Enough to know loss comes for everyone," I said quietly, "but it don't have to stay." She let that sit a moment, then nodded, her gaze slipping back to the horizon. "I hope you're right." We didn't speak again for a long while. The afternoon stretched lazy in gold. A pair of hawks wheeled high above, their shadows crossing the yard like slow-moving thoughts. I remember thinking that peace, when it comes, doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, takes off its hat, and sits down beside you until you notice it's been there all along. Later, she helped me mend the lower fence near the creek. Her skirt caught burrs and dust, but she didn't complain. She worked steady, her small hands knotting wire tight as any ranch hands. Once when the wind threw a strand loose, she laughed, a bright sound that startled the horses and startled me more. "Guess I'm better with numbers than nails," she said. "You're doing just fine," I told her. "Wire don't care who ties it, long as it's done right." As the sun dipped, the air turned copper and long shadows fell across the land. We walked back slow, boots crunching on the gravel path. Neither of us spoke, but something easy had settled between us, a quiet knowing that didn't need to be named. Inside she lit the lamp while I stoked the fire. We ate stew from the same pot and split the last biscuit between us. After supper, she opened a small book she'd carried in her valise and read a few lines aloud. Not scripture exactly, but something that sounded like it had come from the same soil. Her voice was calm, low, certain. It filled the room like light through an open door. When she finished, I said, "You read like a person who believes the world can be gentle again." "I want to believe that," she said softly. "Don't you?" I thought about it, really thought about it. "I reckon I do," I said. "I just forgot what it feels like." She looked at me then, and I swear the lamp caught something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. A reflection, maybe, of what it feels like when two people stop running from their ghosts long enough to stand still together. That night, when she retired to her room, I sat by the fire again. I pulled the old photograph of my late wife from the drawer, the one I'd stopped looking at years ago. The paper had yellowed, edges curled. I studied it under the dim light and waited for the usual sting. But all I felt was gratitude, quiet, unhurried, like the sound of rain after a long drought. I set the photo down, leaned back, and listened to the steady creak of the house settling for the night. In the next room, I heard Zara's footsteps pause, then the soft click of her lamp. And the silence after that wasn't empty anymore. It was full of breath, of warmth, of something too tender to name. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of loss. The next few days came and went like the pages of a slow book, quiet, careful, and full of little things that matter more than they should. I remember waking each morning to the smell of coffee already on the stove, the kind that seeps into the walls before sunlight finds the window. Sometimes she'd be humming, a tune I didn't know, soft as a heartbeat under the noise of the kettle. You live alone long enough, you start to believe silence is all you need. But once it's gone, you realize it was never peace, just emptiness wearing pieces clothes. Zara filled that emptiness without trying. She moved through the house like she'd always been meant to, folding herself into its quiet corners, giving shape to the air. By the third morning, I found her on the porch, sitting with the ledger in her lap and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up when I came out, eyes bright against the dawn. "You were right," she said, "about the feed supplier. They owe you near $40. 40? I whistled low. "That's enough to buy 2 new saddles or 1 good mule." "Or," she said, raising an eyebrow, "enough to put screens on the windows before the flies claim the kitchen." I laughed, and she smiled without meaning to. There's a strange kind of comfort in laughter that sneaks up on sorrow. It doesn't fix a thing, but it makes the road shorter. That afternoon, we rode into town to send her letter and collect supplies. I saddled the mare and an old bay gelding for her to ride. She looked uneasy at first, holding the reins too tight, but the horse understood her better than she knew. By the time we reached the ridge above the valley, she was sitting easy, letting the wind catch her hair like it was born for it. Helena sat small in the distance, smoke curling up from chimneys and the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer cut in the quiet. I hadn't ridden that way since before the loss. The land between the ranch and town carried more ghosts than miles. At the post office, she sent her letter with a hand that trembled just once. When the clerk stamped it, I saw something pass through her. Relief, or maybe the end of hoping for a reply that would never come. We walked the boardwalk after, the air thick with the smell of horses and yeast from the bakery down the street. Folks nodded when I passed, curious at the sight of a woman beside me. I could feel their eyes, but she didn't seem to. She kept her chin up, gaze steady, like a person reclaiming her own story with every step. "You must miss having company," she said as we tied the horses outside the mercantile. "I did," I answered. "Never, didn't know it till lately." Inside we picked up flour, sugar, nails, and a new kettle she insisted on buying herself. Now the shopkeeper, a talkative widow named Mrs. Dyer, leaned on the counter and said, "My Mr. Quinn, you finally brought civilization to that ranch of yours." Zara blushed, the faintest color rising to her cheeks, and I said, "Don't tease the lady, ma'am. She's doing honest work." Mrs. Dyer winked. "I bet she is. And I bet she's got you eating better than beans and regret." Zara laughed then, real laughter, not the polite kind. And I swear, the sound filled the whole room. Even the shopkeeper smiled softer for it. There's a power in joy like that. It can turn a stranger kind and make an old man stand a little straighter. On the ride back, the sky opened wide and gold. The road cut through fields of late summer grass that waved like ocean water. She rode beside me, her skirt gathered just enough to keep from the dust, her face turned to the wind. I found myself stealing glances, catching the sun on her hair, the calm in her posture. She didn't notice, or maybe she did, but let it be. We reached the ranch near dusk. She fed the chickens while I brought in the horses. The smell of supper drifted from the kitchen, beans, biscuits, and bacon fat frying low. I stood by the corral gate a while, listening to her hum that same tune again, soft and unguarded. Later, after we'd eaten, I stepped outside with my pipe. The moon was climbing, the light thin and silver. She joined me on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, though I wasn't sure for what. "For what?" I asked. "For not asking questions you already know the answers to," she said, "and for letting me be more than someone left behind." I looked at her, at the way the moonlight caught her features, and said, "You were never just that. Sometimes a person gets lost. Doesn't mean they stop mattering." She looked down, smiling a little. "You sound like a preacher." "No," I said, "just a man who's been lost long enough to recognize the look." The air grew still between us, heavy with something unspoken but not unwelcome. A coyote called somewhere in the hills, a lonely sound carried clean through the dark. She shivered and drew her shawl tighter. "Cold?" I asked. "Not cold," she said softly. "Just remembering." We went inside soon after, each to our own room, but the memory of her standing there stayed with me. That night, the house felt warm in a way I hadn't known in years, and when I finally lay down, I thought of her words, of how sometimes being seen is its own kind of saving. Sleep came easy, and the last thing I remember before the dark took me was the sound of her laughter, small, bright, echoing in the quiet like a lantern swinging in an empty barn. It was near the end of August when the summer began to slip its hold on the land. Mornings came cooler, the air heavy with the smell of rain that never quite arrived. The horses grew restless, stamping in the dawn mist, and the creek behind the barn sang softer each day, as if even water was tired from the long heat. Zara had been with me almost a month by then, long enough for her to know which board creaked outside my room, long enough for me to learn the rhythm of her steps, quick when she was thinking, slow when she was sad. She had settled into the house the way light settles through dust, patient, inevitable. That morning, I found her at the table, bent over a half-written letter. The window behind her threw gold across the paper. Her pen stopped when I entered. "Another letter?" I asked. She nodded, but her smile was thin. "To my aunt in Boston. She worries. I suppose I ought to tell her I'm alive." Alive's a good start," I said, pouring coffee. "Alive and working better than most." She laid the pen down and rubbed her wrist. "I don't know what to tell her beyond that. She'll ask if I've found a husband or a purpose. I'm not sure which would comfort her more." "Some folks think they're the same thing," I said, half grinning. She shot me a look that was half a laugh, half a warning. "And what do you think, Mr. Quinn?" "I think a person's purpose can change. Sometimes it's raising cattle. Sometimes it's keeping a roof from sagging. Sometimes it's just making sure the coffee don't run out before morning." Her eyes softened. "And sometimes, I said, it's helping another soul remember she deserves to rest a while." She didn't answer, but I saw the line of her shoulders ease, the kind of ease that comes when you realize someone's been standing guard over your quiet without demanding thanks. That afternoon, the sky broke open with thunder, the kind that rattles windows before the first drop ever falls. I was out in the north field, checking a fence line, when the storm rolled over the ridge like an angry god. By the time I made it back to the barn, rain was coming down sideways and the wind was mean enough to tear nails from old wood. Zara was there pulling down the laundry from the line, soaked to her elbows. "You'll drown out here," I shouted over the storm. "Not before you, Jaboff," she called back, laughing, though the rain plastered her hair to her face. I grabbed the last of the sheets, and together we stumbled inside, dripping, breathless. For a while, we just stood there, laughing like fools while the roof thundered. Water ran off our sleeves, pooling on the floorboards. I handed her a towel, and she took it, eyes shining. "You're a sight," I said, shaking my head out. "And you're no better," she shot back. The house smelled of wet pine and soap. I tossed another log in the stove, and the fire hissed as the heat met our damp clothes. She spread the sheets near the hearth to dry. I remember watching her move, the small, sure gestures of her hands, the way she hummed under her breath. Something shifted in the room then. Not loud, not sudden, but real. The air between us grew thick with things neither of us had said. I turned away, busying myself with the latch on the window. When the rain softened to a steady patter, she sat at the table again. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "why some people stay when others leave?" I took a moment before answering. All the time. She watched the fire. Back at the stage stop, I thought maybe I was cursed, that no matter where I went, I'd be left waiting. But now, she paused, searching for the words. Now I think maybe some people aren't meant to be waited for. Maybe they're just meant to pass through, so we can learn what kindness looks like when it stays. I set my coffee down slow. "You sound like you've been thinking deep." "I've had time," she said. "Too much of it, maybe." I smiled a little. "Time's a funny teacher. Charges more than it's worth, but it don't cheat you on lessons." She looked up at me then, eyes bright from the firelight. And what has it taught you, Mr. Quinn? That a man can be lonesome, even when he's surrounded by noise, I said. That sometime quiet company mends what noise broke. She didn't speak, but her gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. The thunder rolled again, far off now, gentle as a drum fading into memory. That night, after she'd gone to her room, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the dying fire, thinking about the things I'd lost, and the strange mercy of what I'd found in their place. The storm moved east, and the world smelled clean again. I heard her door creak once, the soft pad of her bare feet on the floorboards. She appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, hair unbound, face pale in the low glow. Couldn't sleep, I asked. She shook her head. The thunder still feels close. I nodded toward the chair opposite me. Sit a spell. It'll pass. She did. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The fire cracked, the clock ticked, and the quiet wrapped around us like something alive. You said once that quiet can be company, she murmured. I did. She looked at the flames. You were right. We sat there until the fire burned down to embers. She fell asleep in the chair, head tilted against the backrest, her breathing even. I took my coat, laid it over her shoulders, and watched the first light of dawn crawl through the window. Outside, the land was washed new, the kind of morning that makes you believe maybe the past can forgive itself if you let it. The days after that storm felt different, cleaner somehow, lighter, as if the sky itself had decided to give us another start. The earth smelled of damp sage and wet wood, and the creek ran full again, whispering the kind of song you don't notice until you need it. I remember waking that first clear morning to the sound of her sweeping the porch. The rhythm of the broom bristles on the boards was steady, sure, like a heart finding its pace after being lost in a storm. When I stepped outside, she was barefoot, hair tied back, sunlight spilling through the loose strands that had escaped. Her face was soft, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen before. She looked up when I came to stand beside her. Morning, she said. Morning, I answered. My world looks different after good rain. It does, she said, but everything's greener. Even the dust has hope in it. I smiled at that. You've got a poet's tongue, Zara. She laughed quietly. I think I just like the way things sound when they start over. We worked side by side that day, fixing fence posts along the southern pasture. The air was bright, and the ground still soft from the storm, the kind of soil that gives under a man's boot and smells alive. She carried the hammer, I carried the wire, and the silence between us was easy. We spoke when we needed to, but most times we didn't. It was enough to share the same stretch of sky, to feel the same wind pass through. Around midday, we stopped under a lone cottonwood, ate bread and cold beans from a tin. She leaned back against the tree trunk, eyes half closed. I used to think peace was a place, she said. Somewhere far, quiet, untouched. But now I think it's more of a person. Or maybe just a way someone makes you feel safe enough to stop running. I watched her for a long moment. The way her fingers toyed with the edge of the tin. The way the light broke through the branches above us, dancing across her face. That's a fine thing to believe, I said. World might be better if more folks did. She looked up at me then, and for the first time, there wasn't any distance in it. No guardedness, no polite walls, just a soft, honest look of someone seeing you for what you are and not turning away. We rode home as the sky began to bruise with dusk, and the light had that honeyed warmth to it, the kind that makes every shadow look like memory. When we reached the gate, I swung down and opened it, but she didn't move right away. She just sat there, reins loose, watching the horizon. "Something on your mind?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking maybe I don't need to send any more letters." "To your aunt?" She nodded. "She'll be fine without hearing from me for a while. Sometimes telling the story keeps you from living it." "That's the truth," I said. That evening, we ate supper in near silence, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that hangs heavy. It was calm, full of unspoken understanding. Afterward, I stepped outside to smoke while she cleared the dishes. The moon was rising over the ridge, pale and round, the land laid out silver beneath it. I heard the screen door creak open, and she joined me, arms folded against the chill. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. "I did once," I said. "After she passed, I thought maybe if I kept riding west, I'd outrun the memories. Turns out, a man can cross every mountain in Montana and still find his ghost setting up camp wherever he stops." She smiled a little. "Maybe ghosts don't haunt places. Maybe they haunt hearts." "I reckon you're right," I said. "But sometimes, if you keep living right beside 'em, they quiet down." We stood a long while after that, not speaking, just breathing the same air. I could hear the crickets start their evening hymn, the horses shifting in the corral, and the faint rustle of her shawl when she turned toward me. "You've been kind to me, Mr. Quinn," she said. "Kindness is easy when someone earns it." "I don't know that I've earned anything," she whispered. "You have," I said. "More than you think." The night wrapped around us then, wide and tender. She looked up at the stars, and I saw her lips move, maybe in a prayer, maybe just in gratitude. It didn't matter which. I walked her to the door before turning in, my hand brushing against hers as she passed. It was a small thing, barely a touch, but it carried more than words could manage. That night, I didn't sit by the fire. I didn't need to. The warmth had already found its way inside. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch, the soft groan of the wind through the eaves, the faint creak of the floorboards under her steps as she moved about her room. Sleep came slow, but it came sweet, and somewhere in that half-dreaming space, I heard her laugh again. Low, steady, the kind that stays with a man long after the night's gone quiet. I didn't know what we were yet. Two souls sharing the same patch of earth, maybe, or something beginning to bloom slow and certain, but I knew this much. The waiting was over, and the healing had begun. Autumn crept in without asking. It always does out here. First in the smell of the grass, then in the breath of the mornings. The air thinned and cooled, and the light took on that amber edge that makes everything look like it's remembering something. I started finding frost on the railings, thin and glassy, melting by mid-morning, but leaving its whisper behind. Zara had taken to walking the pasture at dawn, a shawl tied around her shoulders. She said it helped her think. Sometimes I'd see her from the barn door, a small figure against a wide sweep of gold grass, moving slow, stopping now and then to watch the horses. I never called out. A man learns to let some silences live on their own. One morning, she came back early, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen since she first stepped off that bench. She carried something in her hand, a wildflower, pale blue, growing out of season. "Look at this," she said, holding it up. It shouldn't even be alive this time of year. I studied it, the stubborn little thing. Maybe it didn't get the news, I said. She smiled. Or maybe it just didn't care. That made us both laugh, and it felt good, honest, easy. She set the flower in a cup on the table, and it stayed there for days, refusing to wilt, like a promise that wouldn't quit. Work on the ranch picked up. The cattle needed driving down to the lower pasture before the cold set in. I saddled 2 horses that morning, though I hadn't said a word about her coming. When she stepped outside and saw the second horse ready, she grinned. "You're trusting me with a herd now?" "I'm trusting you with me," I said. That's a harder job." We rode out before sunrise. The air bit at our fingers, but the world was beautiful in its silence. The ground gave off steam where it met the sun, and every hoofbeat echoed in that endless space like a heartbeat too big for one body. She handled the reins fine, even when the cattle got skittish near the creek. There was a calm about her, a kind that comes only after you've walked through your own fire and made peace with the burn. We worked side by side all morning. No words wasted, no need for them. Round noon, we stopped by the ridge where the land breaks open into miles of nothing and everything. She pulled a small loaf of bread and 2 apples from her satchel. "Breakfast for second winds," she said. I took the bread, tore it in half, and handed her the bigger piece. She didn't argue, just smiled like she knew that was the only way a cowboy knows to be generous. We ate in quiet, watching the hawk circle far above. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly. "Next? After all this, after the fences are mended and the cattle are fed, what happens when the work's done?" I thought about it. "Work's never done on a ranch," I said. "But I get what you're asking. I reckon a man keeps moving until something tells him he's home." She looked at me for a long moment. "And do you feel home here, Mr. Quinn?" I met her gaze. "I do now." The way she looked away told me she'd heard what I didn't say. When we rode back that evening, the world was on fire with sunset, deep golds and oranges bleeding into the horizon. The air smelled of hay and smoke, and the horse's breath came out white and soft. She reached over once, her hand brushing mine on the reins. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a question. It was just there, a quiet truth passing between us. That night, we sat by the fire again. I played the old harmonica I hadn't touched in years. The notes came rough at first, clumsy, then steadier, until the tune filled the room. She closed her eyes and leaned back, listening. "What's it called?" she asked. "Don't rightly know," I said. "Learned it from a drifter when I was 19. Said it was meant for anyone who's still waiting on something they can't name." "I like it," she said. "It sounds like it remembers me." When the song faded, she opened her eyes. The light from the fire caught her face, soft and open, and for a breath, the whole world seemed to hold still. "I used to think love was thunder," she said, "loud and impossible to ignore. But maybe it's more like this, quiet, slow, a warmth that creeps in before you notice." "I reckon that's the only kind that lasts," I said. Neither of us spoke after that. She stayed by the fire a while longer, then stood, wished me good night, and went to her room. But I sat there, watching the flames settle into embers, thinking about what she'd said, about quiet love and warmth that doesn't announce itself outside. The wind moved through the trees, whispering low, and I realized something simple and frightening all at once. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for her to heal. Not for myself to stop hurting. Somehow, in all that silence, we both already begun. By the time September folded into October, the land had taken on that muted beauty only the West can manage. Colors dulled by dust and distance, the kind of quiet that feels older than time. Each morning, frost silvered the fence rails before the sun melted it away, and smoke from the chimney trailed thin and blue against the sky. Zara had made the house her home without trying. There were small signs everywhere, a folded quilt on the porch rail, herbs hanging to dry near the stove, a ribbon tied to the pump handle. The place didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt inhabited, and maybe that was all I'd ever needed. One evening after a long day hauling feed, I came inside to find her standing by the window, holding that stubborn blue flower she'd kept in the cup. It was wilted now, its stem bending under its own weight. "It's dying," she said quietly. I hung my hat by the door. "Everything does," I said, "doesn't make it less beautiful." She turned to me, eyes shining in the lamplight. "Do you ever think about that? About how everything we touch fades, sooner or later?" "All the time," I said, but I figure that's what makes the touch matter." She smiled, and I saw something shift in her, like the first crack in a thawing river. We ate supper slow that night. The world outside had gone still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath before winter. I remember her laughter, soft, uncertain at first, then real. And I remember thinking how strange it was to hear joy in this old house again, like music from another lifetime. After we cleared the table, she lingered by the fire while I poured 2 cups of coffee. I handed her one, and she cradled it in both hands as if the heat itself might speak. "You ever wonder," she said, "why life lets some people find peace while others keep searching until the end?" I thought about it. "Maybe peace ain't something we find," I said. "Maybe it's something we build piece by piece with whoever's still standing beside us." She looked into her cup, quiet, a long time. Then she said, "And if there's no one left?" "Then you start with yourself," I told her. "Build small, steady. The right souls tend to show up once the light's on." Her gaze met mine over the rim of the cup. The room felt small then, smaller than it had any right to be. There was a long silence, and in it, a truth neither of us needed to name. The next day, I found her outside, near the paddock, mending a blanket she'd taken to using as a shawl. Her stitches were clean, steady, better than mine ever were. I leaned on the fence and watched her work. "You know," I said, "for someone who came out here looking for a man, you've turned into one of the best ranch hands I've ever had." She laughed, shaking her head. "I wasn't looking for a man. I was looking for a life." "Well," I said, "looks like you found both." She blushed, and for a moment we were just 2 souls in the wind. No past, no promises, only the simple rhythm of the day. Later, while we brought the cattle in from the far ridge, a sudden squall blew in, wind cutting sharp, sky turning the color of slate. The horses spooked at the thunder, and one of the calves bolted toward the creek. "Stay here," I called, but Zara was already riding after it, determined as I'd ever seen her. The ground was slick from an earlier rain, and when she reached the far bank, her horse stumbled. My heart jumped clear into my throat. I rode hard, fast as the mare would carry me, splashing through the shallow water. By the time I reached her, she'd already slid off and was standing, mud to her knees, hand on the horse's bridle, both of them breathing hard but unhurt. "Reckless fool," I said, voice rougher than I meant it. She smiled through the rain, hair plastered to her face. "You're welcome." I couldn't help it. I laughed. Relief will do that to a man. I swung down, took her by the shoulders, and said, "You could have been hurt." "And so could he," she said, nodding toward the calf now safe on the far side. I wasn't about to watch another thing get left behind. There was no arguing with that. I just looked at her, rain running off the brim of my hat, heart pounding harder than any storm I'd ever seen. "Let's get you home," I said when we got back. Soaked and shivering, I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Her hands brushed mine, cold but steady. She looked up at me then, eyes full of something new, something that made the whole world go still. "You said once that quiet can be company," she whispered, "but sometimes quiet, it's too much." I swallowed hard. "Then maybe it's time we gave it a little company of its own." Neither of us moved for a breath or two. Then she stepped forward, close enough that I could smell the rain in her hair, the faint trace of soap and wood smoke. Her head rested against my chest, and my arms found her without thinking. Outside, the storm softened to a whisper. The fire crackled low, and somewhere in that quiet, two hearts, tired, worn, but still beating, found the same rhythm again. We stayed that way for a long while, saying nothing, because there are some moments words can't touch without ruining them. When she finally lifted her head, she smiled, a small certain smile that reached her eyes. "I guess the waiting's over," she said. "It was over the moment you stepped off that bench," I told her, and I meant every word. Winter came early that year. It rolled down from the high country like a great white tide, swallowing the hills and pressing silence into every hollow. The first snow fell slow and heavy, and by morning the ranch looked new, clean, untouched, the fences half buried and the roof lined with frost. I woke to the smell of biscuits baking and the sound of Zara humming low, her voice a kind of warmth that carried farther than any fire. She'd been with me through the harvest, through the first cold, through the hard wind that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood. I'd stopped thinking of her as a guest weeks ago. She was the rhythm of the place now, the hand that kept it alive, the light that softened its edges. When I came into the kitchen, she turned, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. "You sleep through a blizzard, Mr. Quinn." "Blizzard?" I grinned. "That little bit of snow out there's just the world cleaning itself." "Then it's doing a fine job," she said, setting a plate on the table. "Eat before it gets cold." We ate in the soft glow of morning, the world outside white and hushed. Every sound, the creak of a chair, the clink of a fork, felt sacred somehow. After I pulled on my coat to check the barn, she followed me to the porch, her shawl drawn tight, breath fogging in the cold. "You sure you don't need help?" she asked. "I can manage," I said. "You've done enough for one morning." She looked at me, eyes bright against the gray light. "You never tell me when you do need help." "That's 'cause I was raised foolish," I said. "A man's got to unlearn some things before he can ask right." Her smile was small, but it stayed with me the whole time I worked the stalls, mended the gate, and scattered hay for the horses. When I came back in, she was sitting by the window, stitching the tear in my coat sleeve. The flower she'd found months ago had long since dried, pressed flat between the pages of her journal. It sat open beside her, a quiet kind of memorial. Funny thing, she said without looking up. I used to think healing meant forgetting, but now I think it just means remembering without the pain. I sat across from her, watching her hands move, steady, deliberate, like she was repairing something more than fabric. You're better at mending than most doctors, I said. That's because I know when to stop pulling at the thread, she said, tying the last knot. Sometimes it holds better if you leave it be. That evening, I built a fire high. We sat together, watching the flames twist and settle. The storm outside beat against the windows, but inside the world was small and bright. I've been thinking, I said after a long while, about spring, about their herd, about maybe building another corral, if there's someone willing to keep the book straight. She set her sewing down and looked at me, eyes soft but steady. That sounds like a fine plan. I was hoping, I said, voice lower now, that someone might also be willing to stay. Not as an employee, not even as company, but as home. She didn't speak right away, just watched me the way a person watches the sky after thunder, waiting to see if the calm will last. You're asking me to stay? She said at last. I am. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. Then you should know, Nathan Quinn. I already decided that weeks ago. The laugh that came out of me was rough, half joy, half disbelief. Well, I said, reckon that saves me the trouble of finding the right words. She stood, came around the table, and before I could rise, she bent down, pressed her forehead to mine. The smell of wood smoke and flour clung to her. Her whisper was barely a breath. No more waiting, she said. I closed my eyes. No more waiting. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls, but the house held. It always had. Only this time, it held more than one kind of warmth. When spring finally came, the world thawed slow. The creek ran thick with meltwater. The grass grew green again, and the cottonwood by the gate put out new leaves. One afternoon, Zara stood on the porch, apron dusted with flour, a hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. The sun caught her hair, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where the light ended and she began. I came up behind her, wrapped my arms around her waist, felt the small, steady heartbeat beneath my hands. World looks different from here, I said. It always does when you got someone to see it with, she answered. Down in the pasture, the horses moved slow, the wind playing through their manes. I looked at the life spread out before us, the fences, the hills, the home we'd built from ruin and quiet. And I knew that somehow, in all that dust and sorrow, we both found what we'd been waiting for. I used to think love was a thing that came loud, like thunder rolling off the plains, but now I know better. Love's a quiet thing. It shows up with a blanket in the cold, with a cup of coffee left by your hand, with a voice that says no more waiting, and means it. And on that porch, under that wide Montana sky, I knew I'd never wait again.